Sorry, the music was so low. I don't know why the Bluetooth speaker didn't work today. Every day there's a new glitch. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. La 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 la. Bill in mid-Missouri, Randy in Florida, Stephen in New Hampshire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon back in New Jersey after a challenging few days. Shandora in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Tom, Freilika Mitfuk. A happy Wednesday to you. Paula in Chicago, Bill. Prayers appreciated for my friend Dan, who had a bad dizzy spell at work today. Not sure what the issue was, and it is to be hoped that it was mild and a one-off. But still, prayers appreciated. May your friend Dan... May Bill's friend Dan have a complete and speedy recovery. We say amen. Frank is in San Pedro. Guy in Dayton. Pam in Oregon. Jonathan enjoying the rain in LA. We had some real rain today. At a certain point this afternoon, achuzos is the way we used to say in Chile. Buckets of rain were coming down. Over there on the YouTube side, hi, I'm in Florida. Ella says shalom. Marjorie says shalom. Welcome, everybody. Working our way through Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. Our daf today is Mem Ches, page 48. We're picking this up a few paragraphs from the top on 48a as we work our way through chapter 5, continuing our discussion today of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 5. And the Mishnah talked about what happens when somebody brings their property, their personal property, or their produce into the property, into the courtyard, right, into the real property of the owner. And either the produce or the animal of the visitor is damaged while he or she is there, or the visitor's produce or animal causes damage to the owner of the property. And we're distinguishing between cases where this visitor entered the premises with permission as opposed to entered without permission. So the Gemara relates that there was a certain woman who entered a house to bake. Subsequently, a goat belonging to the owner of the house came and ate the woman's dough. And as a result, the goat became overheated and died. And Rava deemed the woman liable to pay compensation for the goat. Now, certainly if she entered without permission and her dough caused damage to the goat of the owner, she would be liable. What seems to be the surprise here is that she entered with permission. She was allowed to come onto the premises and use the oven of the homeowner. And while she was there baking, her dough got eaten by the homeowner's goat and the goat died, right? So Rava says she is liable to pay compensation for the goat. So the Gemara suggests, shall we say that Rava disagrees with the opinion of Rav? As Rav says, that in a case where someone brings in his produce to another person's courtyard without permission, and the latter's animal is injured by eating it, the owner of the produce is nevertheless exempt since the animal should not have eaten it. And the Gemara says in response, how can these cases be compared? There, in the case where someone brought in his produce without permission, he did not accept responsibility upon himself for safeguarding against the produce causing damage. Whereas here, where the woman brought in the dough with permission, the woman did accept responsibility upon herself for safeguarding against her doe causing damage to the animals of the homeowner. And the Gemara asks, and in what way is it different from the case of the Baraisa that was mentioned previously, where the Baraisa said, in the case of a woman who entered the house of a homeowner without permission in order to grind wheat, and the homeowner's animal ate the wheat, he is exempt. And moreover, if the homeowner's animal was injured by the wheat, the woman is liable. Again, in that case, in the Baraisa, she entered without permission. So the Gemara infers the reason she is liable is specifically that she entered without permission. But if she entered with permission, then she would be exempt if the homeowner's animal ate her produce and was injured thereby. In our case that we're talking about now, the woman was baking there with permission. So the sages said in response, if she entered the house to grind wheat, since she does not require any privacy, the owners of the courtyard do not need to absent themselves from there, and the responsibility for safeguarding against damage therefore rests upon them. But if she enters to bake, she requires privacy. Why does a woman require privacy to bake? Because this is a very modest society that we're talking about, right? Where women don't show, a lot of skin. The society that we're reading about here would not comprehend modern society where there's billboards with women in bikinis all over the place. They would never understand that, right? A totally foreign concept. There, women were very modest. Men too. They were not showing parts of themselves. So even the forearms, right? The woman has to expose her forearms to do the kneading of the dough to prepare for baking. And in the society that we're reading about here, that's immodest, right? Or in other words, she would do that in the privacy of her own home. But this woman, for whatever reason, she doesn't have her own home to bake in. Right? So she's asked, can I borrow your oven? Absolutely, come here. Okay, she needs to bake. She's going to roll up her sleeves. Her forearms are going to be showing. So the owner leaves her privacy, right? He's respecting her privacy, respecting her modesty. So he's not going to be present. And if he's not going to be present in order to respect her modesty, then he, even though he allowed her onto his premises with permission, is not available to safeguard his animals from walking over and eating her dough, either from eating her dough and causing her damage by that, or that the animal might be damaged by eating her dough. He's not present because of these circumstances. But if she enters to bake, since she requires privacy for this, as the process of kneading involves exposing her elbows, the owners of the courtyard absent themselves from there to allow her to bake. Therefore, the responsibility for safeguarding against damage to anything in the courtyard rests upon her. So if she allows her dough to be eaten, she's not going to be able to be compensated for that from the owners. And if her dough causes damage, she is going to be liable for that. Now, the Mishna teaches if one brought his ox inside the homeowner's courtyard without permission, and the homeowner's ox gored it, or the homeowner's dog bit it, the homeowner is exempt. Rava says if one brought his ox into a homeowner's courtyard without permission, and the ox dug pits, ditches, or caves in the property, the owner of the ox is liable for the damage caused by his animal to the courtyard. But the owner of the courtyard is liable for any damage caused by the pit if someone falls inside. Right? So if someone falls, somebody brought his ox onto my land, without my permission. The ox, got bit by a bee and it was stomping its feet and ended up digging a hole in the ground. So then, if that ditch does damage, if the ox, just the fact that he created a pit in my land is damage to my land, and the owner of the ox is going to have to fill in the pit or pay for it to be filled in. He's liable for that. But what's interesting is that once the ox dug that pit and left, right, and he was here without my permission, maybe I didn't even see him do it. I don't even know who did it. But now I find a hole on my land. And now there's a pit there. if that pit causes damage, I'm liable for the damage. Why? Because it's on my land. But wait a minute. When we talk about a pit causing damage, we're talking about a pit in the public domain. So this hole that's on my land, why would I be liable if somebody falls in this hole that I didn't even dig? Answer, number one, in terms of a hole that I didn't dig, but if indeed I'm responsible for it, then I am responsible to fill it in. Why would I be responsible for it? If people come out of the public domain into my land, they came onto my land. Why should I be liable if they fall into a hole on my land? Answer, if I abandon my property, right? If I declare my property ownerless, so even though he did it on my property, now I've made my property part of the public domain, and if I leave a pit in it, I am liable for that. Or if my pit was right alongside the public domain where it's foreseeable that people could easily, not realizing they've left the public domain and entered my land, I have created a hazard, and even if I personally didn't create it, but I don't fill it in, I am going to be liable for that, according to this view. Even though the master says that when the verse states, and if a man shall open a pit, the law of the pit is Exodus 21:33, it limits the liability for a pit to a person who digs a pit, but not an ox that digs a pit, in which case the owner of the courtyard should be exempt. And nevertheless, here in Rava's statement, since this owner of the courtyard should have filled the pit with earth and he did not fill it, he is considered like someone who actually dug the pit. And similarly, Rava says in the case of one who brought his ox into a homeowner's courtyard without permission, and the ox injured the homeowner, or the homeowner stumbled and was injured by it, the owner of the ox is liable. If the ox crouched, ravats, and by doing so caused damage, the ox's owner is exempt. So the Gemara asks, and is he exempt because the animal caused damage when it crouched? Well, wait a minute. Rav Papa said, what is the meaning of the term ravats? It means that the animal dropped feces, related word, irbits, on the ground, and subsequently the clothes of the homeowner were soiled. So consequently, the feces constitute a pit, and we do not find a case of damage categorized as pit that one is liable for causing damage, not to a person, but to utensils, right? The law of the pit is if someone falls in or someone's animal falls in and is injured, okay, you owe damages for that, you pay. But if somebody's utensils fall in the pit and the utensils are damaged, the law doesn't cover that. You're not liable for the damage to utensils. So in this situation, the owner of the animal should be exempt. How is feces a pit? Well, this is pit as opposed to goring or fire. Goring is your animal hurts somebody else, or it's something of your property that moves around and has agency in the sense that it has a will, like your animals, and causes damage. That's in the category of goring. Fire is something that you started, and then aided by the wind can just spread completely out of control. And so other things that can be likened to the category of fire. Pit, the normal case, the standard case is you dug a hole in the public domain and you didn't cover it up and then people fell in it. But any hazard that you created and left in the public domain, which is stationary, is in the category of pit. So if your animal dropped the load in the public domain and then somebody tripped over it and was injured, that might well fall under the category of pit and you would be liable for it. But if somebody, stepped in it and got their shoes dirty and they wanted to be compensated because their Gucci shoes, got animal poop all over them, you would not be liable for that because that would be like damage to a utensil. The Gemara asks, well, wait a minute. This works out well according to the opinion of Shmuel, who says any obstruction is categorized as a pit, and the same law exempting the one responsible for the pit from damage to utensils applies to them as well. But according to the opinion of Rav, who disagrees with Shmuel, and who says that one's property is not categorized as pit until he renounces ownership of it. You dug a pit and left it there. It's like you renounced ownership of it. But if it's your property that's out in the world causing damage, you are liable for that, even if it causes damage to utensils. And so Rav says if it's your property, until you renounce ownership of it, you're liable for any damage that it creates. And so this poop that the animal dropped, it's like your property. And if someone steps in it with his Gucci shoes, so according to Rav, you are liable for that. So what is there to say when the feces is dropped on your property by an animal that entered there without your permission? So the sages said in response, the animal's owner usually renounces ownership of ordinary feces. And so they are categorized as pit, even according to the opinion of Rav. And Rav says in the case of a person or an animal that entered the courtyard of a homeowner without permission and injured the homeowner, or the homeowner was injured by stumbling on the intruder, the person or owner of the animal is liable. And moreover, if the homeowner damages the person or animal, he is exempt because they were on his property without his permission. Rav Papa said, we said this only when the homeowner did not know of the intruder's presence. But if he knew of the intruder's presence, even if he entered without permission, then if the owner injured the intruder, the homeowner is liable. And what is the reason? It is due to the fact that the injured party can say to the owner of the courtyard, although you have the right to eject me from your courtyard, you do not have the right to injure me. Now, obviously, we're making a distinction here between somebody who comes onto your property just to, use your property, like to pitch a tent or let his animal graze on your land or something like that, which is definitely invasive and trespassing, and you have the right to throw them off your land. But that's also distinguished from somebody who enters your property to rob you, and who's perhaps armed and might hurt you if he's discovered robbing you. So if you injure that kind of a person, obviously there's a self-defense aspect to that you will not be liable for injuring that person. But if it's a standard case of trespass, and you get all, upset that someone's trespassing on your land, and you walk up and punch that guy in the face, you are going to be liable according to this law, because even though he was there without your permission and you have the right to eject him, you don't have the right to hurt him. The Gemara comments, and Rava and Rav Papa, who hold that one who enters without permission is liable if damage is caused, follow their lines of reasoning. As Rava says, and some say it was Rav Papa who said it, in a case, and now we're on page 48b, in a case of two people who were both somewhere with permission, or two people who were both somewhere without permission, if they injure each other directly, they are both liable. If they were injured by one another through stumbling over one another, they are exempt. And from this, in other words, just as in the public domain, if two people injure each other because they got into a fight, they're going to be liable. If they injure each other because they just ran into each other, a pure accident, they're going to be exempt. And so likewise, if both of them were trespassing on someone else's property, in terms of their liability to each other, there is no difference. However, if one of them is there with permission and one of them is there not with permission, now we have a situation where their accidental encounter wouldn't have happened if one of them wasn't there without permission. So that's going to change the liability of the situation. So if they were injured by one another through stumbling over one another, they are exempt. And from this statement, it may be inferred that the reason both are liable if either damages the other is specifically that the two of them were both there with permission, or the two of them were both there without permission. But if one of them is there with permission, like for example, the homeowner, and the other one is there without permission, like for example, the intruder who came without permission, then the one who was there with permission, like the homeowner, is exempt if he injured the other. But the one who entered without permission is liable if he injured the homeowner, in accordance with the opinion of Rava and Rav Papa. Now the Mishna teaches if the ox that he brought into the courtyard without permission. So this idea of injury, causing injury. Now one thing is when you cause injury on purpose, and a different thing if you cause injury by accident. So if someone, this is where the law came out. Here's the halacha. If someone enters another person's courtyard or his possessions are brought into another's courtyard without permission, and the owner of the courtyard injures the intruder or damages the possessions, the owner of the courtyard is liable to pay. Although the owner of the courtyard has the right to eject the intruder, he doesn't have the right to injure him. And this ruling applies only if the owner of the courtyard injures the intruder intentionally. The owner of the courtyard is exempt if he injures the intruder unwittingly. So an interesting question is, well, I have the right to eject him. So if I, grab him by the arm and I'm just pushing him off the property and his arm gets injured in the course of that, am I liable for that? On the one hand, I did a direct action that caused the injury. On the other hand, I was within my rights to eject him. So I was not trying to injure him. I was trying to get him off my property. So it's a good argument, it's unwittingly caused an injury, but it was due to my force. This would be a case that would require witnesses and litigation, more facts, and it would not be a simple matter of law to determine the outcome. But the Gemara moves on. The Mishna teaches if the ox that he brought into the courtyard without permission, so back to our Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 5. If the ox that he brought into the courtyard without permission fell into the owner's pit and contaminated the water in the pit, like it fell into my well, so the owner of the ox is liable. And Bava says they taught this law only in a case where the ox contaminated the water at the time of the fall. But if it contaminated the water after the fall, for example, if the animal died there and the decomposing carcass despoiled the water, then he is exempt. And what is the reason? The ox in this case is considered like a pit, and the water has the status of utensils that fell into the pit. And we have not found a case of damage categorized as pit that renders one liable for causing damage to utensils. Therefore, he is exempt. Now, that's weird because the animal fell into my pit. Now you're saying that even though his animal is in my pit, the animal actually now is considered like a pit. And therefore, he's not liable for causing damage to the water that was in my pit, let's say my well, because that's like a utensil vis-a-vis his pit, which is his dead ox that he left in my well. I would have thought he'd be liable. Now the Gemara asks, hold on a second. This works out well according to the opinion of Shmuel, who says any obstruction is placed in the in terms of damages in the category of a pit. And the same law exempting the one responsible for the pit from damage to utensils applies to them as well. Okay, that's by Shmuel. But according to the opinion of Rav, who says that one's property is not recognized, is not categorized as a pit until its owner renounces ownership of it, then what is there to say? Presumably the owner did not renounce ownership of the ox or even of the carcass, which has value. So rather, if this statement was stated, it was stated like this. Rava says that they taught this law only in a case where the ox contaminated the water with its body, meaning its carcass. But if it contaminated the water with its stench, the owner is exempt. And what is the reason? It is because the damage is caused merely by an indirect action. Although the ox's owner was initially responsible for the animal falling into the pit, the stench did not result directly from this action. It subsequently occurred on its own, and one is not liable for damage that is caused merely by an indirect action. Now the Mishnah teaches if the homeowner's father or son was inside the pit at the time that the ox fell, and the person died as a result of the ox falling on him, so the owner of the ox not only pays damages, but also pays the ransom, right? So as we've seen over and over, the ransom is where my ox kills a person. Now, what we've seen before is that this applies when my ox was a forewarned ox, has a history of goring. So now, when my ox kills a person, I am liable not only for the damages, right, the loss of life, but also this additional payment called the ransom, which I do pay to the family, to the heirs of the person who died. But the purpose of the ransom is to exonerate me from liability at the hands of the heavenly court. Right? If I kill a person, I'm liable to capital punishment in an earthly court. But if my ox kills a person, I'm not subject to the death penalty for that in an earthly court. But in the heavenly court, I may be subject to the death penalty. And so as a form of atonement, I pay this additional money to the heirs. Now, that's what the ransom is, kofer, in Hebrew. So now we have a situation where, let's say I have a pit, right? And somebody, and my father was in the pit, God forbid, and somebody else's ox came and fell into the pit, and fell on top of my father, God forbid, and my father died, right? So in that situation, what's going on? Now, it's my pit, right? So if an animal falls in that, I'm liable. But if the pit was on my property, different situation, and especially if his ox entered my property without my permission. So now the ox never should have been there. So if even though it falls into a pit on my property and it killed someone on property where the ox should never have been, and so that's why the owner is going to be liable. And now that his ox has caused a death, he's also going to be liable to pay the ransom. Now the Gemara asks, wait a minute, why does he pay the ransom? Isn't the ox innocuous, in which case its owner is not liable to pay a ransom? And Rav says, well, here we are dealing, right, because when we're talking about being a gorer, a muad, a habitually goring ox, a forewarned ox, that's with respect to goring. Here we have an animal falling on a person at the time that it falls into a pit. How can you say that the ox is forewarned with respect to falling on people in pits? That's obviously some kind of an accident. You can't be forewarned for that. So since the owner of the ox is not liable to even pay the full damages, but only half damages for an action that his ox is considered an innocuous ox for that kind of action, how could the ransom be owed? Right, the Gemara says, but why does he pay a ransom? Isn't the ox innocuous? In which case its owner is not liable to pay a ransom. And Rav says, here we are dealing with an ox that is forewarned for falling on people in pits. Okay, we're probably in the realm of the hypothetical for an ox that has 3 times fallen on a person and killed him when it fell into a pit. So the Gemara asks, if so, the ox is liable to be put to death, because if it is forewarned for this behavior, it is considered to have acted intentionally. So therefore, the ox should be stoned, as well as the owner is liable to pay the full damages and the ransom. So Rav Yosef said in response, not quite. This is a case where the ox saw some grass that intended to eat on the edge of the pit, and it fell in the pit instead. Since there was no intention to cause damage by falling, the ox is not liable to be put to death. But since it was forewarned for this kind of behavior, its owner still pays the ransom. So Shmuel said, the ox mentioned in the Mishna is innocuous. And in accordance with whose opinion is this? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, who says the owner of an innocuous ox that caused damage pays half a ransom. Therefore, when the Mishnah states that he pays a ransom, it means that he pays half a ransom. Now, that's a minority opinion. The majority is there is no ransom in the case of an innocuous ox killing someone. So Ula said the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, who maintains that payment of ransom is applicable even in the case of an innocuous ox. But he states his ruling in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, who says, for damage categorized as goring that is carried out by an innocuous ox in the courtyard of the injured party, the owner pays the full cost of the damage. And so too, he pays a full ransom, right? Rabbi Tarfon is saying, well, yeah, if your ox, an innocuous ox, gores someone and kills them in the public domain, you don't pay the ransom, and you're only liable to pay half the damages for the loss of life. But if your ox is on somebody else's private property and it causes damage there, you're liable for the full cost of the damages. And if it causes a death, you're also liable for the ransom, even if the ox was an innocuous ox for whatever type of behavior we're talking about, whether goring or falling on people in pits. So the Gemara asks, granted, according to Ula, this explanation is consistent with that which the Mishnah the Mishnah teaches. If his father or his son were inside the pit at the time the ox fell, and the person died as a result, the owner of the ox pays the ransom. The Mishnah thereby provides a case of damage categorized as goring in the courtyard of the injured party. But according to Shmuel's explanation, why mention his father or his son specifically? Even if the injured party were another person and not a close relative of the owner of the property, the owner of the animal would be required to pay half a ransom, and even if it was in the public domain. And the Gemara answers, indeed, that is the case. And the Mishnah is simply teaching this ruling by means of the typical scenario, that presumably it was someone from the family of the one who owns the property containing the pit that was inside the pit, but didn't have to be that way. Now, the Mishnah teaches, now a new subject. Back to our Mishnah. Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 5. But if he brought the ox into the courtyard of the homeowner with his permission, then the owner of the courtyard is liable for the damage that is caused. And Rebbe says the homeowner is not liable in any of the cases in the Mishnah, even if he gave his permission for the items to be brought onto his premises, unless he explicitly accepts responsibility upon himself to safeguard them. And it was stated that the sages disagreed with regard to the law in this dispute. Rav said that the law is in accordance with the opinion of the first Tana of our Mishnah, and Shmuel said that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe. So the sages taught a case similar to that of our Mishnah. If the owner of the courtyard said to the owner of the ox, "Bring your ox into my courtyard and safeguard your ox," then if the ox caused damage to the property of the owner of the courtyard, the owner's animal is liable. But if he said to him, "Bring your ox in and I will safeguard it," then if the ox was injured, the owner of the courtyard is liable. And if the ox caused damage, the owner is exempt. And the Gemara says, well, this matter itself is difficult. You said in the first clause that if the courtyard's owner said to the animal's owner, "Bring your ox into my courtyard and safeguard it," then if the ox caused damage, the owner is liable. And if it was injured, the owner of the courtyard is exempt. So the Gemara infers the reason that the owner of the ox is liable and the owner of the courtyard is exempt is specifically that the owner of the courtyard said to the owner of the ox, "Safeguard it." So one can infer that if he granted permission for the ox to enter without specifying that the owner of the animal safeguard it, then the owner of the courtyard would be liable if the ox was injured, and the owner of the ox would be exempt if it caused damage, right? Are we saying that this only works if the owner says, you're liable, you are responsible for your own animal while it's on my premises? And in the absence of such a statement, that the owner says, "I will safeguard." That it is implied. It's as if the owner said, "I will safeguard your animal." Or are we saying that the owner only becomes liable for the animal and what damage it causes or is caused to it when he says, "I undertake responsibility"? But in the absence of that statement, the owner of the ox remains liable, right? Do we need an active statement to create the condition, or is the absence of any statement going to create a condition? So the Gemara infers, right? The reason that the owner of the ox is liable, and I said this already, right? So the Gemara continues its analysis of the Baraisa. I'm going to read that again. The reason that the owner of the ox is liable and the owner of the courtyard is exempt is specifically that the owner of the courtyard said to the owner of the ox, "Safeguard it." And one can infer that if he granted permission for the ox to enter without specifying that the owner of the animal safeguarded it, the owner of the courtyard is liable if the ox was injured, and the owner of the ox is exempt if his ox caused damage. And the reason that the owner of the courtyard is liable is that the Tana of the Baraisa holds that in an unspecified case where the obligation to safeguard the animal was not mentioned, the owner of the courtyard implicitly accepts upon himself responsibility for safeguarding the ox. So, say that the latter clause, if he said to him, "Bring your ox in and I will safeguard it," then if the ox was injured, the owner of the courtyard is liable. And if the ox caused damage, the owner is exempt. Now, the reason that the owner of the courtyard is liable and the owner of the ox is exempt is specifically that the homeowner said to the owner of the ox, "And I will safeguard it." So one can infer that if the owner of the courtyard granted permission for the ox to enter and he didn't say anything to the owner of the animal about who should safeguard it, then the owner of the ox would be liable if it damages the property of the owner of the courtyard, and the owner of the courtyard would be exempt if the ox is damaged. So the reason the owner of the courtyard is not liable is that the Tan of this Baraisa holds that in an unspecified case where the obligation to safeguard the animal was not mentioned, that the owner of the courtyard does not accept a responsibility upon himself for safeguarding the ox. So we had two different conclusions where silence means I accept responsibility and where silence means I do not accept responsibility. So which is it? And the Gemara concludes, we come to the opinion of Rebbe, who says that unless the homeowner explicitly accepts upon himself the responsibility for safeguarding the visiting ox, he is not liable. And based on this understanding, the first clause of the Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, and the latter clause is in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe. So Rabbi Elazar said, yes, indeed, the Baraisa is disjointed. And the one who taught this clause is not the one who taught that clause. And Rava said the entire Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, and no inference should be drawn from the extra words, and I will safeguard it in the latter clause. Since the first clause mentions that the owner of the courtyard instructed safeguard it, the latter clause also teaches that he said, and I will safeguard it, to maintain symmetry. So the same law applies even when granting permission to enter without specification, since, according to the rabbis, granting permission to enter does include an implicit acceptance of responsibility for safeguarding. So if you allow people onto your property, you're accepting responsibility for their personal property while they're on your premises. And if you don't want that responsibility, you have to say so. I'm almost done. If you've got questions or comments, please get them in now. Rav Papa said, the entire Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe, who holds that if no specification was made, the owner of the courtyard does not accept responsibility, as inferred from the latter clause of the Baraisa. And as for the inference drawn from the first clause, he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, who says for damage categorized as goring that is carried out by an innocuous ox, but in the courtyard of the injured party, the owner does pay the full cost of damage, even though it's innocuous, because it happened on the property, on the private property of the injured party. Therefore, if the owner of the courtyard said to the owner of the ox, safeguard your ox, he is clearly not transferring the rights to any portion of the courtyard to him, as is evident from the fact that the owner of the ox must safeguard his ox and may not treat the courtyard as if it were his own. Therefore, if the ox gored, it is a case of damage categorized as goring in the courtyard of the injured party, and one responsible for damage categorized as goring in the courtyard of the injured party pays the full cost of the damage. By contrast, if the owner of the courtyard did not say to the owner of the ox, safeguard it, then by granting him permission to bring the ox onto his courtyard, he effectively transfers rights to an area within the courtyard. And therefore, with regard to damages, it becomes a courtyard of partners. And the one responsible for the damage categorized as goring in the courtyard of partners pays only half the cost of the damage. That concludes our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in chapter 5. Tomorrow, God willing, we'll pick it up with Mishna number 3 at the regular Thursday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. A few questions regarding this, says Jonathan. But if it contaminated the water with its stench, the owner is exempt. What is the reason? It is because the damage is caused merely by an indirect action. Isn't this the same as walking, where the ox kicks pebbles that cause damage? Yes, but the difference is private property. When we're talking about pebbles, we're usually talking about the public domain. But good. Tom, does innocuous matter in the case of trespassing? The ox shouldn't have been there. Dad shouldn't have been crushed by it. I think the sages agree with you, right? They agree with you. It doesn't matter that it was innocuous because, well, at least according to by Rabbi Tarfon. But if it's there without permission and then it falls into the pit's irrelevant. The fact is it was there without permission and it injured, right? And it could have been by trampling, it could have been by stumbling, but it caused an injury to the people who live there. So why does it matter that it's innocuous if it was there without permission? I agree with you. But then I guess the question is ransom. Is the ransom going to be part of it? Because for the analysis of whether the ransom is due, that's a different question than whether it was there with permission or not, since it seems to be tied to whether it was an innocuous ox or not. Sharon, with regard to an ox entering the courtyard without permission, asks, are these oxen just wandering about freely? Seems so unlikely. I think yes and no. I think what they're saying is, first of all, we're always talking about unlikely cases because that's where the interesting matters of law are. But also, the reason that the ox is, well, we keep talking about the ox in these cases and not necessarily a sheep, for example, is because oxen are so big and strong. So even if you put up a fence, the ox, if it was attracted to something in the neighbor's field, would break through. Right? That's why you have an additional duty to guard, but it's not always practical or reasonable to expect people to know that they needed to guard, their oxen when they thought, well, I have a massive field. I let my ox wander there. It's never left the field before because I have a nice fence around it. Today it did, right? So that's one reason. And I think another reason why this could happen is, what movie was it? Famous John Wayne movie, the long cattle drive, bringing the cattle to market. So it's not so easy, right? It's not so easy. They didn't have horses. They weren't cowboys in that same sense. And walking a bunch of oxen to market, it might easily leave the road and enter somebody's property. And then what, right? And finally, Joe, must there be two witnesses to a verbal agreement? So I guess you're probably asking in this context, there doesn't need to be two witnesses to a verbal agreement for it to be binding if two people just made an agreement. But there would need to be two witnesses later if they're going to testify about some disagreement that arose from their contract and now they're litigating it, right? That's what you need the witnesses for. But here, perhaps what you might be talking about is, did he enter with permission or not? Who said, with regards to safeguarding, what exactly was said? Did the homeowner accept responsibility or did he transfer or did he maintain, did he leave the responsibility on the shoulders of the guest, even though he had permission to enter? So if we end up in a rabbinic court, testifying about what was said and what wasn't and what the agreement was, I think, before money can change hands or God forbid, there's criminal liability or some kind of liability because somebody was badly injured, we would probably need the two witnesses to establish that matter, what was said as a fact. And that if verbal agreement arose from what was said, to establish it as a fact, we would need witnesses for that. So that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we're together again tomorrow, Thursday, at 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.